right? Like if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true. It is true, right? But you have to...
That's right. Joe Rogan just admitted that Christianity and the teachings of Christ are true. That clip was from the very end of Rogan's 3-hour interview with biblical scholar Wesley Huff just a couple days ago. And this ended up being the most academic and scientifically supported conversation defending the Bible and Christianity that has ever happened on the Joe Rogan podcast. After Wes Huff methodically addresses every one of Rogan's challenges to the Bible, Rogan had no choice but to admit that Christianity is true. What he says next, though, reveals exactly what kind of man Joe Rogan is when faced with the choice to actually follow God or not. And it is a fascinating case study of human free will. So, I'm Abraham, and this is Overcome Babylon. Make sure to stick around till the end to hear Rogan's reasoning about why he just can't bring himself to follow Jesus. I'll also be breaking down the good, the bad, and the ugly in Wes Huff's interview with Rogan. First, in case you weren't aware, Rogan's podcast has exploded with billions of downloads since it first began in 2009. And it has even boasted over 190 million downloads in 1 month. So Wes Huff's appearance on such a large platform was a big win for Christianity as a whole, especially because Rogan is known to bring a lot of attention to New Age ideologies, psychedelic drug use, and anti-Bible and anti-Christ talking points. Like back in June of 2024, he invited a huge influencer by the name of Billy Carson onto the show, and ironically, Joe openly admitted during the same interview that he likes to listen to people that don't really know what they're talking about.
Well, there's a lot of dudes, unfortunately, who just get on YouTube and they listen to very charismatic people talk that don't know what they're talking about, which I do all the time. But they do it in a way where they pretend they know something is true that's not true.
Yeah.
And people get sucked into it.
I know.
So, of course, Billy proceeded to talk big about his self-proclaimed expertise on ancient texts while stating that the Bible is just an unoriginal and counterfeit document that contains works like the ancient Babylonian creation story called the Enuma Elish, or the 7 Tablets of Creation, that allegedly came long before the Bible.
George Smith, he actually worked at the I believe it was Cambridge. He cataloged it, and it inspired him to write a complete translation of the Enuma Elish and the 7 Tablets of Creation. And he talks about the fact that that information was copied right from those tablets and put into the Old Testament of the Bible. And so, not exactly like it's going to go from here to the Bible, but it went to other ancient papyruses and scriptures and so forth. And then later on, when it was discovered in caves, people took those and then said, okay, we got to put this into a book. And then it became the Bible much later, around 100 AD.
Of course, Billy had been making claims like this for a while. But when he was finally challenged publicly for the first time ever, it was Wes Huff who, with only 24 hours notice, took on Billy over at Mark Menard's Elevating Beyond podcast. And as a PhD student in New Testament studies with an expert view of textual criticism, he was easily able to debunk many of Billy's false claims about the Bible.
I'm just curious, when you say that there are not just parallels, but there's actual copying, looking at Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where the creation story is summarized in the Bible, what are the actual kind of parallels there that you're looking to? Because as someone who's read both, I not only do I not find parallels, I actually, and this is the majority of ancient Near Eastern scholarship with me, think that Genesis chapter 1 is actually an apologetic against documents like the Enuma Elish. So what are the parallels there?
Unable to defend any of his points on the Enuma Elish or the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these texts that are extra biblical, Billy was exposed so badly that he threatened to sue everyone involved with setting up this particular debate, which caused the whole interaction to go completely viral. Joe Rogan was no doubt pressured to invite Wes Huff to sort of clean up the mess that Billy Carson had made in spreading complete disinformation on the podcast just a few months prior to this whole interaction. Of course, one of the very first things they talk about in this 3-hour conversation is the Billy Carson debate, which brings us to the actual Wes Huff interview on Rogan. So let's start off with the good things about this interaction. There are so many good things to say. From the resurrection of Christ to defending the divine authorship of the Bible, Wes presented so many things that not only answered Joe Rogan's many challenges, but also left him pretty shocked. In fact, I seriously lost count of how many times Joe said, "wow," during this interaction. Right from the very beginning, Rogan even says something that is really something out of character about being formally educated as opposed to being self-taught. Listen to this.
This is sort of the problem between with being self-taught rather than conventionally academically trained.
Definitely.
Where you're trained in very specific disciplines and you're taught to understand the foundation before you understand like how to put a window in. You know, I know a lot of Christians that can quote you some versions of the New Testament, some Psalms, but the real, the go all the way to the back, way, and that's what you've done. That's very interesting. So this is like, how old are you?
I'm 33.
Which is very young for someone who
Spring
has
chicken.
The depth of knowledge that you have.
Now, like I said, this is an interesting thing to hear from Rogan. Huff continues to establish credibility throughout the discussion and starts by sharing his personal testimony of seeking God after experiencing a miraculous healing event that took place early on in his life, where he overcame a really rare paralyzing disease with no cure. About halfway through the conversation, he even pulls out an actual facsimile that he made on a piece of legitimate papyrus that he then gave as a gift to Joe.
I make papyri facsimiles. So you were talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one.
So it's one thing to see, a papyrus on Google Images or on the internet. It's another thing to actually physically hold it, right? So I thought this was a really clever tactic and approach to really prove his points. And I think Wes Huff did a great job here. He also explained the great Isaiah scroll super well, the scroll that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, and this greatly impressed Rogan as well.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word?
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of other videos floating around about this interview, and like I said, there are a lot of good things to talk about. Overall, I think Wes did a great job and has helped many people to understand that the Bible can be easily defended, even under the highest level of scrutiny. It passes all the tests of being divinely inspired, authored, and supernaturally preserved over thousands of years. Now, let's talk about the bad things, though, that I think most people will overlook out of their excitement for the many good things that Wes had to say. First, Wes is actually extremely biased when he's examining the Bible, but in a way that I think most people would never notice. Here's what I mean by that. He holds to the idea that the Bible was written for us, but not directly to us, which is a true and good hermeneutical principle to an extent, but Wes is always trying to view the Bible through the exact, and I mean exact, lens of the ancient people of the Near East, which was the original audience that the Bible was written to, and he's taken this approach so much so that this view has actually created a strong bias within his ability to interpret the Bible properly. Just look at how he interprets Revelation 21, verse 1.
And even in the book of Revelation, at the end of the Bible, it says that in the new heavens and new earth, there will be no sea. And it's not because, I had a friend who was Australian, and we were kind of working through translating sections of Revelation. And he's like, hold on, there will be no sea. It's like, I'm Australian. I love the sea. And but the point of that, though, is not necessarily that like the body of water is not going to exist. It's that the ocean, the sea, is so unpredictable. You go out there and storms, can come out of nowhere and you die.
Right.
And so there are these like motifs that are representational in the ancient world. And we see a lot of those in these creation stories.
So Wes interprets this verse of Revelation on the basis of how the people of the ancient Near East would understand it. The motifs of the day, or in other words, the recurring themes in extra-biblical literature and thought, was that the ocean is chaotic. So he interprets Revelation 21:1 to say that there will be an end of chaos. And in my opinion, this is a very valid interpretation of the book of Revelation because it is a highly metaphorical and allegorical book of the Bible. It's a book of prophecy. And when it comes to prophecy and poetry in the Bible in particular, it's actually necessary to interpret many things not literally, but figuratively. The problem, though, is that Wes takes the same approach in places where it's completely inappropriate to do so. For example, numerology. And as you know, my work here at Overcome Babylon is heavily based on accurate, interconnected, and systematic studies of biblical numerology as presented in Genesis chapters 5 and 11, Leviticus chapter 25, the history of Israel's kings, and other places. But look at how Wes sees the numerology of the Bible, and you're going to quickly see why this view is so dangerous.
Yeah, numbers are tricky in ancient languages because it's not entirely clear whether numbers are meant to be representational.
Is that like why they said that Noah lived 600 years old?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, you have that, and you have the Sumerian king lists, which have people living thousands of years, hundreds and thousands of years too. And there are some interesting academic articles on like the probability of the numbers. And you look at some of these lists and they're operational and all divisible by like 12 and 60. And you're like, what's going on here? So not all of them, but enough of them where it's statistically impossible. I don't totally know what to make of those things because you do have the genealogies, I believe it's Genesis chapter 4 and Genesis chapter 11, where they're all divisible by these types of numbers that were very common in the ancient Near East.
So Wes says that he's not sure what to make of the numbers in the book of Genesis specifically, which directly connects to the age of the earth and the history of mankind, but he's not actually telling you the full truth. The reality is that Wes Huff fully rejects the literal numerological history of Genesis, and his interview with Rogan reveals what happens when you decide to go down that particular road.
So as a Christian, what do you think about all this stuff? Like, what do you think about ancient hominids, Australopithecus, Neanderthals? Like, what was God up to with all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I got to stay in my lane. I ultimately would be an advocate for intelligent design.
Okay, so if you're not familiar with the term intelligent design, this is actually a secular point of view and not a biblical one. Let me give you an example. So the two men who discovered the DNA double helix structure in 1953 were two guys named Watson and Crick, and both of these men also believed in intelligent design. Their version of it, though, is called panspermia, where they believe that aliens seeded life on Earth. So again, intelligent design just means that you believe in some sort of a creator, generally speaking. So this was a pretty weak idea to present, but it also reveals a secular compromise in Wes's theology. And when Rogan brought up the whole idea of hominids, which are kind of like primitive human life forms in evolutionary thought and worldview, rather than talk about a biblical concept like the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6, or maybe demons or fallen angels, Wes, he pays lip service to the baseless theory of evolution.
I mean, humanity obviously looks very different today than it did, if we're going tens of thousands of years ago.
Right.
So again, Wes Huff said that he doesn't know what to do with the numerology of Genesis, but he's being a politician about this. That clip I just showed you proves that he throws biblical numerology out of the window. He ignores it, doesn't care about it. I mean, this is bad, okay?
A lot of people read the origin stories in Genesis as a scientific textbook, and I think ultimately that misses the point. When they read Genesis chapter 1, are they looking at that as an exact prescription of what God did? I mean, in some ways, maybe, but in other ways, they could see that as this like counter-apologetic to the other ancient Near Eastern stories, like I explained. So I just think we need to be careful when we're looking at, or even like counting up the genealogies and coming up with how old the earth is. I think that might be missing the forest for the trees.
Again, the reason I'm taking the time to cover this interview is because I'm seeing a lot of people get really excited about it. And it was mostly good. But it's a really important thing to point out that Wes takes the Bible super allegorically, and even though he never plainly admitted it, which I thought was strange, he is a theistic evolutionist of some sort, which is a blatant compromise of the truth of the Word of God through and through. There's just no way around it. So this idea of what did the ancient world think about this? How would someone living thousands of years ago interpret this text of the Bible or this text? Continues throughout the interview to a fault. Not only does Wes look at the book of Revelation in a figurative way, along with the book of Genesis, but he also looks at the 3 days and 3 nights of Jesus being in the grave as purely metaphorical or possibly metaphorical. So at one point, Joe challenges the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus in basically every way you could possibly imagine because he's trying to disprove it, right? It's like, maybe I can get him with this, maybe I can get him with that. And he wonders if Jesus could have faked his death. Wes goes into how the Romans were really good at their job of crucifying someone. So Joe then wonders, okay, where the Bible talks about Jesus being entombed for 3 days and 3 nights, could this be metaphorically interpreted to be a longer period of time than it really was, like maybe months instead of days, so that Jesus could have maybe recovered from the crucifixion and he didn't actually die? So this is where things get pretty interesting.
Are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
The thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and 3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
So it's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting. It's not like it was 3 days, it was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
No, not like that.
Again, look, I'm not trying to be a jerk. Like I said, I think Wes did a great job, and he's very sharp. I just can't believe he would say that 3 days and 3 nights is not to be taken literally. I've done a video about this here on the channel before, and you can check that out. Jesus was absolutely 100% in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, just like he said he would, right? Because the timing of events in the Gospels is perfectly connected to Passover and the requirements of the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. So if you go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, Paul literally says, "Indeed, Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us." So this is a crystal clear concept that Christ was the Passover lamb. He didn't die after Passover, before Passover. He actually was the Passover lamb. Now, like I said, I've covered this before. When you look at the complete timeline, you don't even need extra biblical sources. You don't need anything else. You just look at the Gospel of John chapter 12, verse 1, and it says 6 days before Passover, these events happened. Then John chapter 12, verse 12 says, in the morning, the next morning, they did this. Mark chapter 21, verse 18, again, the next morning, and you just keep going. And then 2 days before Passover, and then finally the day before Passover, that's where Judas betrays Jesus. It talks about all these different things. Luke chapter 22, verse 1. And then Passover day is where we read about, okay, he's taken at night, in the middle of the night, and then early in the morning at 9 a.m., the decision is made to crucify him. He is crucified at 9 a.m., and he's actually dead Yeshua is dead at the 9th hour, which would be 3 p.m. He's put into the grave. That's when you start counting. Or as soon as Passover day is done, because he was the Passover lamb, you start counting, okay, one evening, 2 evenings, 3 evenings, you look at the sons, 1 son, 2 sons, 3 days, 3 nights, and then he rises from the dead anytime in the evening, bleeding into Saturday and Sunday, right in between, right? Because of the Jewish timekeeping or the Hebraic or biblical timekeeping, evening begins the next day, and that is Resurrection Day, which also coincides with Wave Sheaf Day, which is a prophetic, biblical, and biblically significant day. I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. That is all connected to the Passover timeline because we're given very specific scriptures to confirm this. And so one of the next things that was also particularly bad was Wes Huff's knowledge of the biblical calendar.
What's the earliest interpretation of calendars? Like what is the earliest where they did decide what a year was?
I have no idea.
Because you got to imagine if you're...
So instead of saying, I have no idea, what he should have said is that the Bible itself contains the oldest calendar in existence because the Hebrews had to know when the Sabbaths were in order to observe them every single week. But also, God's people have always needed a firm understanding of timekeeping in order to actually obey God and observe God's holy days or holidays of Leviticus chapter 23. So the correct answer here is that the oldest, most intact calendar is in the Bible itself. Even before the book of Leviticus was written by Moses, we see the first Passover reference in the Bible with Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Abel brought a firstborn of his flock, and Cain brought an offering from the ground. Now, what most people fail to realize is that Cain and Abel were most likely twin brothers, but Cain was the firstborn. So in ancient times, the firstborn would always work alongside the father of the household, plowing the fields, while the youngest would be tending the sheep or the livestock. That's why David was tending the sheep while his brothers were hanging out with their father when Samuel came to anoint David as king over Israel. So going back to Cain and Abel, the problem with Cain's offering is that it was not a first fruits offering as required by Leviticus chapter 23, verse 11. So that is why Cain's offering was rejected by God. We then see the second Passover reference in the Bible inside of Genesis chapter 18, when the theophany of Abraham with the 3 men, being God, come to visit him in his tent. This happened on Passover. And listen, if this information is going over your head, all of these details are explained in Bible Prophecy Secrets, chapter 14, actually. So download the entire book. There's a link down below. Make sure you grab that. So again, it is clear that the righteous lineage of Adam had the correct understanding of the calendar even before the flood took place in order to observe things like Passover. But sadly, Wes basically ends up agreeing with Rogan that the oldest calendar that we know of in the world today is the Göbekli Tepe from southern Turkey.
Archaeologists, okay, there it is. World oldest calendar, 12,000 years old.
Yeah, that's wild.
So it is on Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, so we've talked about the good. We've talked about the bad. And now let's talk about the ugly. Just the downright ugly. And honestly, the only thing that falls under this category is Joe Rogan's response to a question about Jesus that Wes Huff asks at the very end of the 3-hour interview.
In all of this, what do you think of Jesus? Like in terms of your own like journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
Okay, so first of all, I love how Wes worded this. Okay, I love how he said ultimate questions, because if he would have said something like ultimate truth, right? Or something like that, Joe maybe wouldn't have even addressed the question that the way that he did. So I'm not going to play Joe's whole response here, but I am going to play the key moment where he gets to the point, because he kind of danced around it for a little bit.
Right? Like if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, right? But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
So even though it's not surprising that Joe would say something like this, it is still really, really sad to see that Joe says that he just can't bring himself to submit to Jesus. He wants to live life on his own terms. He wants to live life his own way and do what's right in his own eyes. Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And what Matthew says, when Jesus is speaking in chapter 11, verse 30, it says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And before that, of course, he said, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And I can 100% testify to the fact that this is fully true, and I have never been the same since Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, reached out to me, and I reached out to him in prayer, and he radically transformed my life forever. Never been the same since. And addictions, curses, all kinds of problems in my life, he radically transformed those things. But Satan, on the other hand, because if you don't choose, if someone doesn't choose, in this case Rogan, to follow the God of the Bible, by default, okay, serving yourself isn't a choice. It's either God or the devil. In one way, shape, or form, you're either promoting one or the other. And what the Bible says about Satan is that when he's brought down, this is Isaiah chapter 14, verse 15, when he's brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit of hell, of basically the deepest part of the earth, is one way of interpreting it, those who see you, that's talking like people are going to see Satan, will gaze at Satan and consider you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world a wilderness as a wilderness, and destroyed its cities, who did not open the house of his prisoners? And so Satan is a cruel taskmaster, full of destruction and constantly seeking to devour and destroy God's creation. I don't know about you, that's not who I want to serve. So what's my final verdict on the Wes Huff interview with Joe Rogan? First, if you haven't been exposed to ideas surrounding textual criticism and how we understand that the Bible that we hold in our hands is the legitimate, inspired word of God, then you should watch this interview, okay? Secondly, if you don't know how to defend the canon of the Bible, so like why do we have the books in the Bible that we have, and how to tell whether or not some ancient extra-biblical text is a forgery or some sort of a counterfeit gospel, then you absolutely should watch this interview. And finally, if you want to get a better idea of how to defend doctrines like the legitimacy of Jesus' crucifixion and his miraculous resurrection, Wes Huff offers insights that will absolutely bless you. But just keep in mind, Wes is not a literal young earth creationist. He only believes in intelligent design. And this is a very different point of view from guys like myself. Wes also rejects the genealogical records of Genesis as being literal. And because of that shortcoming, he is sympathetic towards the imaginary worldviews of things like evolution or theistic evolution. Wes also applies hermeneutics inconsistently. So he'll use the same approach for the book of Revelation, which is highly allegorical and metaphorical, and interpret the book of Genesis or the Gospels in the same way, which is a big problem. And the thing about Wes is that he's a really interesting sort of paradox, right? On the one hand, he is able to both academically and scientifically defend the legitimacy of the Bible. He is able to tell you that it is what it claims that it is, the Word of God, and how, and all the sources and resources that go into understanding and discerning those things. But when it comes to actually upholding the core Christian doctrine that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, Huff does fall short. He takes a lot of liberty to interpret the Bible metaphorically when it is meant to be interpreted literally, and he, like most Christians, is unable to discern the truth of things like the 3 days and 3 nights account of Jesus' entombment in the Gospels because of a clear disregard of upholding and observing God's law as presented in the first 5 books of the Bible, or Torah. And this is, again, exactly why I wrote Bible Prophecy Secrets. Right from the very beginning of Bible Prophecy Secrets, I show you the 3 laws of interpretation, along with what I call the golden rules. There's 3 of them for properly interpreting the Bible. These are skills that will equip you with a solid foundation and proper worldview that apparently even some of the most educated men among us fall short of achieving. Because like I said, here's the real secret, and I've already pointed it out. True biblical wisdom is not about how much head knowledge you can pile up. Learning comes from doing, practicing, and observing. And that's what Bible Prophecy Secrets will show you. So thanks for checking this video out. I'm your brother Abraham, as always. And remember what Psalm 19 verse 7 says. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. And the testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. God bless you, and I'll catch you on the next one.